Welcome back. This is Raul Lowry Contreras. This is the Contreras Report with a very special edition, continuing with part 2 of Cinco de Mayo. Should Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, be an American holiday? Question mark. Let's see if we can answer that. Let me remind you in yesterday's presentation, or the previous presentation, that in 1861, French, British, and Spanish troops landed in Mexico to collect foreign debt that the Mexicans owed because the new president, Benito Juarez, had canceled foreign debt because Mexico was broke after a 2-year civil war, a bloody 2-year civil war. The French, the British, and the Spanish landed in Veracruz Harbor and took control of it, which meant that anything imported into Mexico by boat, which is the only way things were imported into Mexico in those days, were collected by those three armies, those three soldiers. They collected the customs and split it up as payment, as part of repayment of the national debt to foreign bankers in Europe. Okay, so the French were there. They decided to stay. The British and the French, the British and the Spanish negotiated a deal and they left. The French stayed because they decided to conquer all of Mexico and make it a client state of the French Empire. They brought in an Austrian prince, Maximilian, to take over the Empire of Mexico and to do it on behalf of Napoleon III, who ran France. He had sent his best soldiers from what was considered to be the best army in Europe to Mexico in January of 1861, and they proceeded to stay when the British and the Spanish left. They set out for Mexico City. They took the same route that Hernando Cortez took in 1519 and the Americans took in 1846. That is, from Veracruz north to what is now the city of Puebla, and then west about 100 miles to conquer Mexico City. In those days, the European tradition was if your capital city was occupied by a foreign army, you were defeated and you surrendered. The Mexicans, though, were not quite Europeans. They didn't surrender when Mexico City fell. But in 1862, the French army arrived in Puebla, and there they were met by 4,000 poorly armed Mexicans, some Indians, and led by a Texas-born general, Ignacio Zaragoza. The battle occurred on the 5th of May. 8,000 French troops. That included 2,000 Mexican royalists, 6,000 French troops. Total 8,000. Marched up the valley leading to the two forts, Loreto and Guadalupe. And there they met the Mexican cannon from the forts, which were zeroed in, and the mud that was like knee-deep because it had been raining the night before, and the Indians that came without weapons, unless they had, they had machetes and bows and arrows. But what they did is they took cattle that they brought with them to feed the army, and they moved it back and forth across the valley during this monstrous tropical rainstorm. I mean, we're talking like maybe 8 or 10 inches of rain all at one time. And so it was mud up to their knees. The French were just slaughtered. And when their cavalry came on the scene with beautiful ostrich plumes on their helmets, riding European plow horses, remember, these were not the wild Mustangs that the Mexicans had tamed after the Spanish came and horses got loose, because there were no horses in the Americas when the Spanish arrived. The Mexicans became what was considered to be the finest light cavalry in the world, and by any observer. So they attacked the beautifully ostrich-plumed French cavalry and wiped them out. The soldiers on the ground, the infantry, were mired in the mud, and the Mexicans pounded and pounded with their cannon. And then Colonel Porfirio Diaz, who later on would be president and dictator for over 30 years, decided to attack against his orders. He had been ordered to hold the line, hold the middle, no matter what. Well, he got tired of holding the line, and he took his 2 regiments, and he ordered a frontal attack on the French. And guess who turned and ran? It wasn't the Mexicans. The Mexicans won that battle. Okay, so part two. Mexican morale spiked sky high when news of the Mexican victory at Puebla spread. The French army was demoralized and Paris was shocked. It sent thousands more troops to Mexico. It even sent the vaunted French Foreign Legion to Mexico to serve in the, quote, Tierra Caliente, the hot land, of the malarial Mexican jungles between the port of Veracruz and the mountains of Mexico and Mexico City. Sacrificing foreign troops to mosquito attacks was preferable to placing French soldiers in peril of dengue, malaria, etc. Here again, the French met disaster at the hands of Mexican horse soldiers and guerrilla irregulars that controlled every inch of Mexico where French soldiers weren't standing. Near a town named Camarón, which means shrimp in English, a French Foreign Legion company of 62 legionnaires accompanying a mule train carrying $3 million worth of gold to pay French troops was ambushed by Mexicans. The legionnaires retired to a walled hacienda with only one way in, one way out. The Mexicans ferociously and continuously attacked the surrounded legionnaires. They fought back. The legionnaires fought back as hard as humanly possible. Their commander, Captain Danjou, lost his hand in the firefight, and the wooden prosthetic developed for him is memorialized at Legion headquarters even today in honor of his and his men's heroism. Today, only 5 French legionnaires survived the fight. It was on April 30th. The day the legionnaires were annihilated at Cameroon is celebrated, get this, as a national holiday in France. I leave it to the French to honor a combat defeat. The French slowly conquered and occupied much of Mexico up to the border with Texas. Unfortunately for the southern Confederate states that wanted French munitions, cannon, and other war materiel, the Battle of Puebla on the 5th of May 1862, Cinco de Mayo, had delayed the French Confederate plan to flood the South with everything it would need to win the war with the Union. Coincidentally, whenever the French approached the Texas border, French soldiers and legionnaires would desert and dash to the land Napoleon III hated so much. By the time the French secured the border at the Rio Grande and could start supplying the Confederacy, 2 major events occurred that buried Napoleon III's dream to incapacitate and destroy the United States of America. The battle for Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, through which supplies moved between Texas east to the rest of the Confederacy, ended after many weeks of siege by General U.S. Grant's troops, cutting the Confederacy in two on July 4th, 1863. The other event was the Battle of Gettysburg that commenced on July 1, 1863, and lasted 3 days. The first 2 days advantaged Confederates. The third day was won when Union troops crippled and beat back the famous charge of 12,000 to 15,000 infantry of Major General George E. Pickett's charge, a frontal assault that cost the Confederates 6,000 dead men. The loss at Gettysburg cost the Confederacy the war. The reason for the loss? Many posit the Confederates did not have enough cannon and cannonballs to overwhelm the Union troops with a monstrous heavy cannon assault. They might have if the 4,000 Mexicans had not slaughtered the French army on the 5th of May, 1862. While the French favored Confederates started their string of losses that would lead to surrender in April 1865, the French continued chasing the Mexican government in a wagon of Benito Juarez, who stayed a step ahead of them in the deserts of Chihuahua. That's the state just south of Texas. He outran them for another year. Then in April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army of Northern Virginia, and the American Civil War ended. The final surrender of Confederate troops occurred in Texas in June 1865. Union General and future President U.S. Grant immediately dispatched 50,000 battle-hardened Union troops, including General George Armstrong Custer, brevet general by the way, to Texas to form the border with Mexico Army of Observation commanded with the Mexican Army. The Mexican Army of Observation commanded by brilliant cavalryman General Philip Sheridan. Its job, watch the French and spank them if they tried to cross the border in hot pursuit of Mexicans of the Juarez persuasion. The French lodged heavy-duty diplomatic objections to the American Army on the Texas border. Objections were not limited to the French. General Grant told the press that, quote, the Civil War, the American Civil War, was not finished until the French are out of Mexico, unquote. General Sheridan, Philip Sheridan, promptly condemned captured Confederate rifles, cannon, and supplies and left them unguarded on the Texas side of the Rio Grande. Mexican Juarista bandits crossed the river every night and stole, quote-unquote, the material. Juarez troops stole 40,000 American Army rifles, former Confederate rifles. As a bonus, special discharges were prepared for American soldiers who were charged $6 for their rifles and kits, that's their equipment, if they crossed the Rio Grande and joined the Mexican Army for $10 a month, the same monthly pay as the American Army paid. Estimates are that 3,000 Americans joined the Mexican Army. They were formed into the American Legion of Honor, obviously to combat the French Foreign Legion. They rode in the Victory Parade in Mexico City in 1867 when the Mexicans chased Napoleon's French back to Europe where he lost his throne. And the French promptly lost the Prussian-German War in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Let's consider then what the Battle of Puebla of May 5, 1862, Cinco de Mayo, means not only to Mexicans, but to the United States and all of the Americans that have died since that day, or lived since that day. The French could not supply the Confederacy with sufficient cannon to win the Civil War because the Mexicans kept them out of most of Mexico by defeating them at Puebla long enough for the Union to win at Vicksburg and Gettysburg on the same weekend of July 1863. Abraham Lincoln and Benito Juarez led their nations to victory with 23-year-old lawyer Matias Romero working between them to forge a new world from the new paradigm that started with Lincoln and his Republicans winning the American presidency just 6 years after his party was founded, and Juarez winning victory in the War of Reform in the same year. Today's United States of America and Republic of Mexico and the more than 450 million free men, women, and children of both countries are living monuments to those wet, cold 4,000 Mexican soldiers and irregulars that defeated Europe's finest army in a valley of death, of French death, outside Puebla, Mexico, the 5th of May, 1862, Cinco de Mayo. That is the story of Cinco de Mayo, before the 5th of May, on the 5th of May, and since, especially right after the 5th of May. I tell this story proudly, being Mexican-born and an American citizen, of a natural-born American citizen, because that period of history really brought the two countries together. Yes, they've had problems since 1914, 1916, and they, of course, had problems even before that. But today, the United States and Mexico are two countries that are joined together by trade, by populations. After all, 34 million people in the United States, mostly American citizens, are of Mexican heritage. Many of whom came, or whose families came, between 1910 and 1920, when Mexico had its last shooting war. Well, there was a little one after that. But since then, it's been peace between the two countries, arguments now and then, $1 billion in trade, and 1 million people crossing the border every day. Every single day, 1 million Americans and Mexicans cross that border. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. The European Union might qualify as one place where that happens. This happens every day. The Mexicans spend billions of dollars in the United States. Americans spend billions of dollars in Mexico. Up to or over 1 million Americans live and work in Mexico. Right here where I am in Baja California, it's estimated between 250,000 and 300,000 Americans live and work. So, the United States and Mexico, another year of peace, tranquility, trade, and good relations. All because, I think, of Cinco de Mayo. I hope you've enjoyed your Cinco de Mayo. I hope you've enjoyed this bit of information about what Cinco de Mayo is. And again, I'm Raul Lowry Contreras. This is the Contreras Report, a special Mexico edition. We look forward to you being with us on our next post. Subscribe on YouTube or Facebook or both, and you'll be notified when we post a new one. Thank you for being there.